Welcome to Behavioral Health Today, a podcast brought to you by the Triad Network. This podcast is designed to share trending topics occurring within the world and our communities and bring them a behavioral and mental health perspective.
Welcome to Behavioral Health Today, a Triad production. I'm your host, Dr. Graham Taylor. My guest today is Dr. Jennifer Garrison. Jennifer is an assistant professor at the Buck Institute of Research on Aging and an adjunct assistant professor of gerontology. Jennifer's pioneering research focuses on how neuropeptides, the brain's signaling molecules, regulate behavior and influence our aging. Using cutting-edge techniques, she examines the impact of neuropeptide changes on reproductive decline and overall longevity. A recipient of numerous prestigious awards, including the Alfred P. Sloan Research Fellowship, Jennifer's work explores the critical brain-ovary connection and seeks to develop interventions for age-related conditions. We're excited to dive into her groundbreaking research today and explore how these findings could help delay the aging processes and improve health span, particularly for women. Jennifer, welcome to our show.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here.
It is nice to have you. You know, as we jump in, I'd love for our listeners to get a little bit of a backstory on you, where your interest in this field developed, and how it's led to your work with aging and improving health span.
Sure. I, like many scientists, I did not follow a linear path. I started as an undergraduate at UC Berkeley in molecular cell biology, and I spent quite a bit of time really at that molecular level thinking about protein structure. But then when I went to UCSF to get my PhD, I was really fascinated with chemistry. So my PhD is actually in chemistry, and chemical biology is an interesting field that marries chemistry and biology in a way that we try to use chemistry as a tool to study biology. And that was where I first developed a love for bioactive peptides. I spent my entire PhD trying to figure out how this natural product, so this very complicated molecule made by a fungus, was actually blocking expression of a cell adhesion molecule, something that's important for inflammation. And this molecule, which had a terrible name called Hun 7293, was a cyclic peptide. Anyway, that's a long story.
It's a good start.
When I moved on, it was a mix of cell biology and synthetic organic chemistry, but I was really thinking about how these cyclic peptides that fungi were making could mimic things in our own body and really play around with what the cell is doing. And so when I started thinking through what I wanted to do as a postdoctoral fellow, so I don't know how much your listeners will be familiar with what happens if you want to be a scientist in academia. After you get your PhD, there's a decision point where you can go and do lots of things. You could go and work in policy. You could go and get your JD and become a patent attorney. You could go and become an advisor for lots of different kinds of investment places. You could go and work for a company, a biotech or a pharma company. But you could also, which is what I did, stay in academia and hope to, at some point, have your own laboratory and direct your own research, which is the path I took. And so after my PhD, a necessary step in my training was to do a postdoctoral fellowship. So essentially a whole PhD over again, but in a different field. And that's important because when you finish your PhD, you know, I'm sure you know this, you're a real expert in the things that you focus your project around. But if you want to direct a laboratory and be a professor at a university, it's really important that you be able to think broadly about a lot of different areas of science. So I switched fields entirely during my postdoc. I moved to the Rockefeller University in New York, and I worked for Cornelia Bardman on neural circuits and behavior. So a total left turn, but I felt like the brain is it's arguably the most complex object in the universe, in the known universe. And really the biggest black box with respect to understanding female and human physiology. So as a postdoc, I started studying neural circuits and how they control behaviors. And that, again, naturally led me to thinking about bioactive peptides, because they are, first of all, the most numerous signaling molecule in the central nervous system. So there are literally hundreds of them. But they also tend to modulate circuits, which means that if you think about the anatomy, we talk a lot about the physical architecture of the brain. And we talk a lot about mapping the connectome. I don't know if you've ever had that discussion here. And there's a lot of really huge, large-scale efforts to think about mapping the physical architecture of the brain. We call it the connectome, which shows how neurons and other cell types in the brain are wired together physically, like a circuit diagram. And those are really like, typically when I talk about wiring in the brain, people think of synapses, right? Which are the physical connections between two neurons. So the map of all those connections collectively would be the connectome. And it's like you could liken it to like a city's road network, right? And so the map, the anatomical map of all those connections between all those neurons is absolutely required to understand brain function. Don't get me wrong. But there's a second map that's made up of biochemicals, neuromodulators, it's a separate dimension, essentially, brain function. And those neuromodulators are like the traffic control system that can essentially completely transform how the physical road map functions without actually changing any of the roads themselves, right? The roads stay the same, but the biochemical layer, it's a parallel map that can essentially dynamically alter circuit function without changing the physical architecture. So it can specify, for example, which circuits are active when. It can turn up or down how sensitive a circuit is to particular inputs. These neuromodulators tend to influence things that happen on longer timescales. So in your nervous system and in your brain, a longer timescale would be something like a behavior, right? Synaptic function, the electrical firing of neurons, that happens on a millisecond timescale. Behaviors can develop over seconds, minutes, hours, even days. And so some of those longer timescale things that your brain controls are controlled by these bioactive peptides. Similarly, things like emotion, mood, those are all things that would be controlled by neuropeptides and neuromodulators. Does that make sense? So
that
when
makes
I started,
total sense. It's a wonderful example of these two maps and how they, in a very integrated way, can be very impactful. Continue.
I mean, honestly, we know a lot about the anatomy because there's no mystery there. Like you can record from the presynaptic neuron, the neuron on one side of the synapse, and you can record electrically from the neuron on the other side. And there's no question about what's happening. But when you're talking about this biochemical map, which isn't constrained by the physical connections, these biochemicals can signal over long distances and long timescales, then suddenly it becomes much more challenging to understand the architecture of that biochemical map. But you absolutely need the biochemical map, and you need to understand they're orthogonal. And so you need to understand how they're related to each other as well. But if we can understand the rules and the signals that are governing the flow of information between them, then that will really give us the complete picture of how the nervous system works. So that's what I was really interested in as a postdoc.
It's fascinating. Well, take it a step further for us. As we understand kind of these neuromodulators and the biochemical map that maybe we can more clearly understand over time, explain the role of some of these, neuropeptides and how they function in our lives and the importance of appreciating what they do, what they can do, maybe what happens to them over age, but help us appreciate what they really are in their role.
Yeah, absolutely. I think most people wouldn't realize it, but most people have heard of and maybe even thought about neuropeptides in their daily lives. So GLP-1, for example, is a neuropeptide. So all of the drugs that people are interested in right now, Ozempic, Mounjaro, those are targeting peptidergic systems. Oxytocin, which is a really interesting neuropeptide that controls a lot of aspects of maternal function, but also controls social behavior and sometimes aggression. So social interactions beyond just maternal behavior and physiology. Things like, I don't know if you've ever heard of MPY or orexin, or, there's neuropeptides that control sleep and wakefulness. There's neuropeptides that control appetite and fluid homeostasis. There's neuropeptides that control lots of different conversations between the brain and the rest of the body. Like I said, there are hundreds of them. So they have a huge impact, not just on physiology, but what's really cool about some neuropeptides is that they're controlling not just the physiology, but also the associated behavior. Does that make sense?
You're talking about it, our energy balance, our sleep, our stress levels, our moods. Yeah, it has a kind of a rippling effect, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think about it. I mean, the way I talk about it to non-scientists is I say that in my lab, we study the mind-body connection.
Mhm.
And really, I think about, and I call them bioactive peptides because neuropeptide, which is how they've been described since they were discovered, is really a misnomer because while they were discovered in the nervous system, and that's why we call them neuropeptides, they can actually be made and also sensed by non-neuronal tissue, which means we should really just call them bioactive peptides. Anyway, they're important for all sorts of things. And when those systems get dysregulated, they can lead to a whole host of different disorders, diseases, and potentially systemic aging. That's really the thesis upon which my lab is built, the idea that changes in what I call the brain's Wi-Fi signaling, right? This long-range signaling that happens between the brain and the rest of the body, that might be one of the first dominoes to fall with respect to systemic aging.
Jennifer, how do they typically become dysregulated? And maybe along with that, what does the aging process have to do with it?
I would say those are the open questions that form the basis of all of our research. So we don't know much about how, like at a molecular and cellular level, we understand a little bit about how neuropeptides are made and stored and released. What we don't understand is what triggers them to be released, once they're released, how they travel to signal, and how they function in the target tissue. And we certainly don't understand very much about how they change with age. And part of this really just comes down to the challenge in studying a long-range signal, right? These things are not active until they're released from a cell. They're not acting inside of the cell they're made by. They're made and then they're released in response to different signals and inputs. Then they have to travel to whatever their target cells are. And that could be far away, it could be close by. Then they have to actually bind to what we call receptors on the target cells. And then that activates a whole host of downstream processes in that target tissue. And then something happens. And along the way, between the cells where they're released and the cells where they're sensed, there's another layer of regulation in that there are binding proteins that can sequester peptides once they've been released. And then there are also enzymes that can cut up or degrade peptides, either en route to where they're going or at the target tissue. And so there's all these layers of complexity and regulation that are built into these signaling systems on purpose, right? I mean, I think of, it might be a little simplistic, but I think of bioactive peptides as one way that the nervous system can encode flexibility, right? That's how something like a behavior, which if you consider it in the context of an evolutionary background, evolving a new brain region takes millennia. But evolving a new behavior needs to happen on a time scale that allows an animal or a human to escape being killed or escape starving to death or escape something on a time scale that's not millennia long. And so having all this flexibility built into the system really allows evolution to innovate on a time scale that's commensurate with not going extinct.
That's really good. The idea that these are released downstream, talking about, and that the downstream targeting, the ability for us to look at two things. One, how they get dysregulated, and maybe how inflammation and aging impacts that. And then moving a little bit in just a moment to what can we do about these things? What are some options to us? And how might life be optimized, or maybe some inherent challenges that someone might be going through? How could we intervene in ways? I know you're looking at some issues with reproduction with women. How can we enhance some areas of challenge with folks?
I would say that our research is really focused on trying to understand that question. How do neuropeptides change with age? And we're focused around a part of the brain called the hypothalamus, which is really where I would call it the control center for the neural circuits that really dictate homeostatic systems. And homeostasis, when we're talking about it in the context of the brain, really means those body-wide systems that are absolutely essential and critical for maintaining you alive. Things that, if they're not working, then you will die. Things like energy and fluid homeostasis, body temperature regulation, reproductive function, and circadian rhythms, those are all controlled by this area of the brain called the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus is a really interesting spot because it's incredibly neurochemically diverse. It makes and uses dozens, at least, of these neuropeptide signals. And it's also an interesting part of the brain with respect to aging. So, inflammation, we know there's the word inflammaging. We know that inflammation increases in your body with age. And that's
Can you pause just for a second around that? Just for a second.
Yeah, sure.
What is inflammation? What does that even mean within the body?
So inflammation is a process that your immune system uses primarily to help you heal, to ward off infection and to stimulate healing, especially when you have something like tissue damage, whether that's a cut on your skin or something that happens internally. It's a process that stimulates healing. And in the most simplistic way to talk about it is that immune cells recognize invaders and target them for destruction.
Yep.
But then also the immune system recognizes damage and calls in backup to help stimulate healing. And part of both of those processes is that some immune cells release a whole cocktail of things that turn on inflammatory pathways, so turn on inflammation. In many contexts, that's beneficial.
Yes.
But when it gets turned on in a way that's not regulated, or when it gets turned on too high, or when it happens in places that it's not supposed to happen, right? So in places where there's no damage or where there's no invaders, when that happens, then that can actually damage your tissue. And one thing that happens during aging is that inflammation goes up all over your body. So in places and in ways that are not required for wound healing or fighting off infection. And so that kind of dysregulation really negatively impacts your tissues. Like wherever that inflammation is happening, it causes damage. And so we have this word called inflammaging to describe that. But in your brain, inflammation with age, it's not uniform. It happens in very specific places. And one of those places, a hotspot for inflammation during aging, is the hypothalamus. So one simple idea is that increase in inflammation in the hypothalamus with age maybe leads to dysregulation of some of these key control neurons that are governing these homeostatic systems. And that then disrupts this Wi-Fi communication between the brain and other tissues that are important for maintaining homeostasis. And that might lead to some of the things that we associate with normal systemic aging, right? What do you think of when you think of aging? Not disease, but just normal aging.
Yeah, I think things don't heal quite as quickly. I think pains stay around a little bit longer. I think reaction time isn't quite what it might normally be. I think things like level of aggression, I think changes over time, at least for some males that tend to be competitive. Things maybe aren't quite as sharp or quite as quick. Those would be some quick things that come to mind.
Yeah. What about disruptions to sleep?
Yeah, it's lighter and it is maybe not quite as lighter, not as deep, and easily kind of awakened. Absolutely. Yes.
Yeah. So many of those things you just mentioned are governed by that.
Yeah.
Those homeostatic neurons in the hypothalamus.
Yeah.
Pain is mediated by multiple different neuropeptides. There's just such a rich area of neurobiology that we really haven't explored. So a lot of what we do is we ask simple questions like, how does peptidergic signaling change with age? Like what's changing and in what direction is it going? The question of the immune system is also really fascinating from the perspective of peptidergic signaling. Neuropeptides mediate crosstalk between the nervous system and the immune system. We don't really understand how that works either. So there's a lot we don't know.
Some cool things happening and some fun things it sounds like to kind of track and watch. But it sounds like the work is in the explanation of exactly what's going on when these things are occurring.
Right now, we're at that phase where we're just we're just able to monitor and manipulate neuropeptides in a way that we weren't 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And so lots of exciting work going on, not just in my lab, but in lots of different labs. And, a few years ago, we sort of backed into thinking about this conversation, this chemical conversation between the brain and the ovaries in females, partly because when we think about aging, there's this funny difference between males and females that when you think about it, is actually pretty profound. So I think most people are familiar with the idea that human females tend to live a little bit longer than human males, on average, a few years. And some of that can be explained by the increased risk-taking behavior that males engage in when they're young. That leads to their death and then lowers the average lifespan in males. But not all of it can be explained by that. So there are some true differences there. But even though females tend to live longer than males on average, if they're lucky enough to live to old age, females will spend a significantly longer period of their lives in poor health. So if you think about your lifespan as being divided into two parts, there's the bit of time starting from youth all the way through wherever it is that you start to experience what I would call age-related diseases. And then there's that period of time at end of life where you're sick and unhealthy. And that's what I'm talking about. So this period of time, we call it health span, that period of time that you're healthy. Females have shorter health spans than males at baseline. And that's pretty disturbing given that we're spending a lot of time thinking about how to extend healthy longevity. So understanding what's underlying that shortening of female health span is pretty profound. And it turns out to be primarily caused by the fact that ovaries in females age faster than the rest of the tissues. So my ovaries are aging about 2.5 times faster than the rest of my tissues, if you're thinking about it from a functional perspective. And that is what sets up this difference in health span, because I think many people don't recognize that ovaries are important for more than just fertility and baby making. They're clearly essential for that. But in addition to their role in fertility, ovaries sit at the center of an equally complex signaling network. And they are talking to nearly every tissue in the female body. They talk to brain, to bone, to heart, to liver, to skin. I could go on. And we don't know very much about those individual conversations, but what we do know is what happens when you take them away. And so I think what we can say in aggregate is that ovaries are the architects of health in female bodies. In fact, at any age, they are promoting health. And so when they're not working properly, in young people or in older people, that can uncover risk for a whole host of different disorders and diseases. And so that's when we really started focusing less on the brain and more on thinking about what's driving ovaries to age faster than the rest of the tissues in the female body as a way to understand pathways and mechanisms that we could exploit to extend healthy aging in females.
We'll be right back after word from our sponsor.
Most of us spend more time at work than anywhere else doing anything else. So why not spend that time in a job you love? Introducing Triad's Jobs Marketplace, the only job site dedicated specifically to behavioral and mental health professionals. Featuring more than 1,000 open jobs from dozens of behavioral and mental health employers, and searchable by location, professional field, employment type, specialization, and more. Jobs Marketplace helps you find your next career opportunity. Full-time, part-time, or gig time, make the most of your time. To access Jobs Marketplace, register for your free professional account at hellotriad.com/BHT. That's hellotriad.com/BHT, and then click to Jobs Marketplace. If you're already a member of the Triad community, visit app.hellotriad.com/jobs. That's app.hellotriad.com/jobs. Visit us today and take your next career step tomorrow.
I want to talk a little bit more about that in what we get to do maybe proactively in some ways to help with the aging process and the things you're describing. Just before we get into that, what does your lab look like? I'm curious as to paint a
What does
picture
it look
for us.
like?
Yeah, what's it look like?
Oh,
If I
do you
walk in
mean
the
like how
door,
many?
what am I seeing?
Oh, labs are pretty messy. You walk in the door and you're seeing benches. Every researcher in my lab has their own workspace, which we call a bench, where they've got shelves full of supplies and tools. And maybe you see each person standing at their bench with an ice bucket full of stuff, and maybe they're doing stuff with pipettes and setting up experiments and moving things between tubes. You'll see equipment, so large incubators, centrifuges, microscopes, and then you'll see all the people who work in my lab doing stuff. Research labs are made up of people who are in their training at different levels. So we have undergraduate students from UC Berkeley. We have post-bac students. So these are students between their undergraduate and whatever comes next years. So that might be graduate school or medical school or something else. And they might take a year or two to do a post-bac program. Then we have technicians who are staff who decided that they just love doing experiments and want to continue doing that. And then we have PhD students, sometimes master's students who are working on independent projects related to their theses. And so I mentor them and we develop their projects together, and I help guide them through how to execute a research project that would eventually end up resulting in a publication and a written dissertation.
Very good.
And then there are postdoctoral fellows. So these are people who've already gotten their PhDs somewhere else, who've come to my lab to do a second multi-year project to learn about what we do. And then, of course, after their postdoc, they can go wherever. And then we have staff scientists, lab manager, people who are more senior and provides continuity, because there's a lot of trainees who come and go from a lab on different timescales. So does that
pretty active
give you a
place.
picture?
That
Yeah,
gives me.
very
I just
active.
walked in the door and I got a great picture right there of what folks are doing and busy as a beehive in there. Tell me, we hear about, and it's I think becoming more and more at a conversation level, some in the media as well, docs who are working on the aging process and the prescription of neuropeptides, or you're saying maybe bioactive peptides. What are some of the things that people are doing in a supplemental way that
Oh, gosh.
are of benefit? Is that an okay thing to ask?
Yeah, of course, you can ask me anything. I'm not a medical doctor. I'm a PhD scientist, and so I don't give medical advice. But I can tell you what the data says. And I can tell you from my perspective as an expert in this space, what I think. One thing that I think really escapes most people and even most doctors is that bioactive peptides or neuropeptides, those signaling systems are so complex. So how they function is completely dependent on the amount of peptide, the location of the peptide, and the timing, right? So what else is happening in the system? These things are not happening in isolation. And so you can get different impacts from the same peptide depending on the context, the location, and the amount. There's a few situations where administering peptides is necessary and important for some kind of a medical procedure. During childbirth, for example, for women who need to have labor induced, sometimes labor happens naturally, but oftentimes, especially in older women, it doesn't happen fast enough. And so we induce it by actually administering a peptide that's a synthetic version of oxytocin. So oxytocin, one of the many things it does is to induce contractions in the uterus. It literally binds to receptors on the uterine muscle and induces contractions during childbirth. And Pitocin, which is what doctors administer to women to induce labor, is a synthetic oxytocin. Now, square that with what other things you might know about oxytocin. So oxytocin is important for milk letdown during lactation. It's important for orgasm in females. It's important for social bonding between mother and infant. It's important for social salience cues between humans. So some people call it the love hormone, but it is not the love hormone. It provides context for social relationships between humans, meaning in group interactions, oxytocin can promote affiliative positive feelings between two people who know each other already. But for out-of-group interactions, it can actually promote aggression. So there's a lot of nuance there. And oxytocin is very similar to a neuropeptide called vasopressin. And vasopressin does completely different things. Vasopressin is important for fluid homeostasis. for fluid reuptake in your kidneys. It's really important for all kinds of other things. And oxytocin and vasopressin can bind to each other's receptors because they're so similar. And there's so much complexity here that the idea that somebody would inject any one of these peptides as a way to stave off aging or it is crazy to me. Now, I know there are a lot of skincare products that contain peptides, and I think that dependent on how much evidence there is, published papers with reasonable numbers of experiments and repeats, I think that there's a case to be made for topical application and some sort of benefit to skin. But systemic administration, I think there's very few examples where that's been shown to be safe and effective.
I appreciate that. That's helpful to know that. We're kind of rounding the corner here, but I'd love to hear maybe just as you're looking forward to in your future here in your research, what are you most excited about and planning for?
I'll be honest with you. I'm very excited about the work in my lab. Some of the things we're trying to do are to understand what are the signals that are made by ovaries. So what kind of neuropeptides, what kind of other neuromodulators are made by ovaries that signal to the brain, so the opposite direction. And we're doing a lot of discovery-based science around that as a way to potentially either improve hormone therapy or to understand enough about normal ovarian function that we could potentially prolong it. Not to prolong the fertility side, but to impact that healthy aging side. That's what's happening in my lab. But what I'm most excited about is this global consortium we started a few years ago to really increase research on this topic. So this idea that we need to study ovarian aging and really understand fundamentally how ovaries work and how they change during aging as a way to think about female health span. We started a global consortium. We give away grants to scientists all over the world, and we've created a whole community of researchers and early stage company founders and policymakers who are trying to advance not just ovarian aging research, but really women's health research. And I think this is a place where we have been underfunded and female bodies have been understudied for 100 years. And so there's a real push now to change that. And I'm very excited to be helping in that direction.
That's really cool. Really cool. I would love, Jennifer, our listeners to be able to follow up with you and just your work. And I just love this conversation. Fun to nerd out together around this stuff. Yeah, I love this. And just kind of bringing us into something here that's both very complex, but you make it, at least for our level here, understandable and something that allows us to have a curiosity and interest in. So I'd love our listeners to be able to follow up with you after the show. How can they best track you down and learn about your work? What's the best way for them to contact you?
Yeah, we have a lab website. It's garrisonlab.com.
Okay.
And then the Global Consortium, we actually just renamed it because I think we have to stop calling ovaries reproductive organs because they're important for other things. So we had to change our name because we had that word in the name. But you can find us now at productivehealth.org. Get it? Reproductive, but with the RE crossed out.
Very good.
So productivehealth.org. And you can find information about what we're doing and the research we funded and the discoveries that are being made. It's not my work. It's other people's work, but I'm so proud of what they've accomplished in a very short period of time.
Appreciate that. We'll put that on our site as well.
Thank you.
It's been great to be with you. Congrats on what you're doing. What a fascinating area and what application it has to so many lives. So really appreciate you being on the show. And thanks for our time today.
Thank you for all the insightful and interesting questions. I really appreciate the discussion.
Appreciate it. Great to be with you today, Jennifer. Thank you. Also want to thank you, our listeners, for dropping by and joining Jennifer and me today. It's always great to have you with us. And hey, by the way, we'd love to have you help us spread the word about this podcast to help us grow and to reach more people, allowing them to discover the valuable insights that get shared on this show. To help us do this in this way, we would love to have you leave us a review and to share this podcast with a friend. Thanks for doing that. And just a reminder, our episode today and its resources, along with our other episodes, can be found on our webpage at triadhq.com/BHT. Thanks again for being with us on the show. And we'll look forward to having you back with us next time on Behavioral Health Today.
We appreciate all the support from our community, and if you like our show, one of the best ways you can support it is by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review. Behavioral Health Today is a podcast part of the Triad Behavioral Health Network, all rights reserved.